Okay, I think we're live.
Hi.
Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the second live show for the Fellowship of the Read Along, our Lord of the Rings read along. Today we're going to be discussing The Two Towers, so the second book in the series, and I am very excited to get into all of our thoughts. And let's just jump straight into it. There will, of course, be spoilers throughout this live show. So if you're not quite through this one, then maybe just wait and come back and watch the live show later on, because we will be delving into all of our thoughts. But without further ado, let's get into it. So first up, Lucy, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Okay, yeah, so I'm Lucy, I'm from the channel Crescent Pages, and I've read this book, I think this is my third time, so I'm having a lot of fun with Kira having just started this series, so it's great to have two different kind of perspectives.
Yeah, I think so. And of course, you are on my channel, but I'm Kira, if anyone doesn't know me. And like Lucy just said, I'm reading the Lord of the Rings series for the first time. So far, having a really good time doing it. And it's always so much fun reading with other people as well. So I'm really enjoying that. So for each of the books, we thought it would be fun to start the live shows just with some like fun, light-hearted questions and see how our opinions kind of change throughout the series. And so our first question is just, who is your favourite character from this installment of the series? Lucy?
Well, I can never just pick one because I can't, I'm too indecisive. For this one, I definitely say Faramir for my first favourite character because I really love his kind of attitude towards war. He's very peaceful, and one of my favourite quotes from this book is from him. And I'd also say Frodo because I just admire how strong he is and how determined he is to do what he was tasked to do. And I just think he's such an admirable character. So definitely those two.
Um, I think I've kind of gone with three characters here because for different reasons. The first one is just to clarify that my favourite character still overall is Sam, but I wanted to kind of offer something else so that I'm not just doing the same one every time. So Sam is still up there as my favourite. Another favourite in terms of how interesting I found them was Gollum. I think Gollum is a bit of an interesting favourite because he's obviously not a very likeable character, but he really added a lot to this book for me in terms of how much like interest there was surrounding him, his background, and like who he was as a character. And then my other favorite was Treebeard, because I just
Yes.
love him. That's favorite characters. And then on to favorite places.
I really like Rohan, not necessarily because of the place, but I think the way that the people and their culture is described. I like how they're almost these warriors, they're very desirous of glory, and I like how Tolkien kind of interprets that. So I really like how he depicts Rohan.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me it would have to be like the forest with the Ents, because I just love,
Aragorn.
like, yeah, it's just so beautiful, and I really like how Tolkien sort of responds to nature and how much effort he puts into describing like the physical landscapes of like where the characters are exploring. But I think this one had something really special, being that that physical landscape actually was characters in and of their own right. So I really liked that. And let's see, what is everyone else saying? Oh, I love this point because it's so true. Love them all for different reasons about characters.
Yeah,
It's so
definitely.
hard. And then we have someone agreeing about both of our favourites, Gollum and then Legolas and Gimli.
Oh, yeah. Honestly, their friendship is just so amazing in this book, especially.
And you did mention that you have a favourite quote from Faramir. Do you want to share that?
Yeah, so it's I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for its glory. I love only that which they defend. And I always, when I read that quote, I just find it really encapsulates his perception of war, and I just think it's such a beautiful quote. So definitely
Yeah,
that one.
That is a very good quote.
Mhm.
My quote that I kind of noticed right from the beginning was one from Aragorn, and I just feel like it was quite a, I guess, like overarching statement that really continues to pop up right throughout the book. And it just simply says, there are some things that it is better to begin than to refuse, even though the end may be dark. And I just feel like
Yeah.
that is something that we being applied to a lot of the things that go on in this book, but in particular, we also see Frodo kind of struggling with this throughout, because he does sometimes kind of really need to refocus and remotivate himself and kind of remind himself of that mindset, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
So I really like that. I mean, Aragorn always has great quotes, let's be honest. And then finally, before we jump into our thoughts on like the book in more detail, because in the beginning of this book we see the characters kind of splitting up at the end of the book, the fellowship kind of broke off, and so we have a few different groups of characters. So if you could only pick to be with one of those groups, which one would it be?
I feel like Merry and Pippin have an easier time in this book, so
Yeah.
I'd probably go with them because they're just like chilling with the ants. They're not really, I mean, they are kind of still in a violent kind of environment, but compared to Frodo and Sam and then Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, like they don't have to do a lot compared to them. So I definitely go with Merry and Pippin.
I had the exact same thought. I was like, obviously it starts off not that great, what with the orcs and everything, but once that's kind of left behind, they have a pretty good time, I think.
Yeah.
So I definitely would want to be with them. Okay, so obviously continue to let us know all of your opinions in the comments, because it's really fun to see what everyone else is thinking. But we are going to jump into our thoughts on the book. And of course, if any questions come up as we go, just leave them in the comments and we will get to them as we're discussing the book. But first up, we've kind of touched on it with the Ents, but like, obviously you've read the books several times, and I just kind of wondered what you were thinking about the addition of new sort of sets of characters and races like the Ents.
Yeah, I think that especially the ants, I found them interesting how they kind of joined the landscape and they begin almost reluctant to get involved. They say that they've weathered all these ages and they'll continue to do so. They don't really involve themselves in battles between wizards and men and elves. And I think their progression throughout the books, or I think it's in one chapter, but I think that does happen with quite a lot of the people who do get involved. You can see it with the hobbits getting involved with this massive war that's totally beyond their kind of understanding of the Shire. And I really liked how Tolkien brings in these different peoples and shows how they become integrated in this war and they play a part. And I also just like the Ents for they almost reminded me of the elves, the fact that they're so ancient and they almost don't really feel like they belong to Middle Earth anymore. They kind of have outlived their time.
Yeah.
But for the Ents, they're still willing to contribute, even though it isn't necessarily their age anymore.
Yeah, I found them to be really interesting. Obviously, like I said, Treebeard was one of my favourite characters, but I think there's something almost hopeful and calming about their presence because of how ancient they are and the fact that they've continued to go on. And in the face of such a huge task like Frodo and Sam are facing, it's kind of like there's almost like a calming presence in the sense that regardless of what happens with them, really, the like landscape will live on, which I think is like quite an interesting sort of concept, because humans, or in this case hobbits and men and elves and stuff, are all living their own lives, but they're living it in this earth and landscape that is so much older than they are. And I think that's kind of interesting. And then like you said, obviously at a certain point the sort of fights and battles between these sort of other races does then start to impact on the landscape, which is obviously like a big issue in and of itself. So I definitely found them interesting. And also someone pointed out that they wish they found their Ent wives, which is so true.
Oh, maybe after the War with the Ring.
Yeah, maybe. And that's interesting because I've obviously not seen the films yet, so I'm interested to see how like the Ents are portrayed in the film, because obviously that's like such a unique concept.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward. I'm going to be starting the films this week, I think. So I'm really excited.
How exciting!
I can't wait. Next up, I thought we could talk about like heroism and how the book explores different sort of forms of like heroism, and is it necessarily always just that classic hero, or does this book kind of show you can have heroism in a few different ways?
Yeah, so like I was saying before with Rohan and how those people were depicted, they're very much, I guess, when you think of a warrior, I feel like that's how the Rohirrim kind of fit into that archetype. They're very, like, they want to go straight into battle, and Theoden very much wants to be part of it. He doesn't want to be in a siege like Helm's Deep. He wants to just ride head on into the battle. That's how they perceive heroism, and that's how they perceive glory. And then you can see that with Aragorn and some of the other characters. Aragorn does fight and he does fit into that kind of warrior figure. But then you take the hobbits, for example, who in the Shire, they never have any fights, they don't have any violence. And yet, Sam and Frodo, you see them as heroes. So it means you don't necessarily have to be a really good fighter to be a hero.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think, like, obviously in the Fellowship of the Ring, they choose a group of characters to go along with Frodo to attempt to aid him with his journey. And that group of characters is very diverse. And so I think in selecting that really mixed group of people to go on this one sort of collective journey is kind of a good indication for the fact that heroism and strength can be found in lots of different ways. And I think then, as you see those characters splitting off into their own individual groups and trying to sort of honor that journey that they were supposed to go on together, you again do really start to see that like you can find heroism in loads of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's such like a prevalent theme or message that Tolkien's trying to get across, the fact that even if you think you're insignificant or small, it doesn't mean that you can't help to change the world.
Yeah, and also like it's not always even in your actions or the fulfillment of your ambitions that makes you a hero. Sometimes it's just simply the act of deciding to try and to like
Yeah.
attempt for it, because these characters all go out knowing that there's a likelihood that this will end badly, and yet they're still heroic and courageous for choosing to take on the task regardless of that potential negative outcome.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting contrast perhaps between, because with the Rohirrim, they're very much, they want to be in battle and have that glory because glory is the reward of them being heroic. Whereas with Frodo and Sam, there's one point where Frodo says that he wants people to know what he's been doing, but then after a moment, he's like, it doesn't matter if nobody knows what we've done. That's not the point. The point is to do it because it's for the good of Middle Earth. It's not for glory or renown.
Yeah, there was a discussion that Frodo and Sam had, which was like really cute, which was quite close to the end, I think. And essentially, like, Sam was trying to like motivate Frodo by telling him about what like fathers will tell their sons about them and how brave he was and everything. And then Frodo goes and says to Sam, and they'll be like, "But what about without Sam, Frodo wouldn't have been able to do anything." And I'm like, "Oh my god, you're making me cry."
Wait until you get to the film.
Stop.
Like the way that they do that speech is like, oh god, so emotional.
And I feel like there's something even like heroic in the way that they constantly try to motivate each other, and like they recognize that their strength comes as a pair rather than individually.
Yeah, definitely. Like they say numerous times that, I mean, Frodo says that he wouldn't have been able to do it without Sam. It's like a group effort. There's
Yeah,
not one hero in these books. They're all heroic in their own way.
yeah. I absolutely love this comment. It says, it's their intentions that mark them as heroes as much as their actions. And that is
Definitely.
true in this book, I think. absolutely. But yeah, so I definitely think in this book, I mean, you could really probably attach the label hero to like the vast majority of the characters, I think.
Yeah.
It's just depending on how you decide to like define it, I guess. And then moving on to one of my faves, Aragorn, his character development in this book. What did you think of it?
I think at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring and at the beginning of the Two Towers, he does have almost this doubt about how he can participate in Middle Earth or what is happening. And I know that he doesn't know whether he wants to go straight to Gondor and reclaim his throne or whether to continue with Frodo. And at the beginning of this book, he's very much like, I still don't know what to do. And I think there's a quote where he says, or Legolas says, that we choose to follow you. And Aragorn says that you've given it to an ill person or you've made like a bad choice. But I think when he comes into contact with Éomer and the Rohirrim, he shows that he does have the ability to lead and bring all these people together to fight against a common enemy. So I think that is progression. It shows that he's kind of aware of his role. He's aware that as such a powerful figure, he has the opportunity to exert real influence. And I think that he does definitely begin to fulfill that role in this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he is like right from the introduction of his character in the Fellowship of the Ring. I think a born leader. Like you recognize him as someone to be followed, but I don't think that's necessarily a sort of part of his character that he necessarily embraces. And then I think at the beginning of this book, we obviously are without Gandalf at the beginning of the book, and Boromir is gone, and so immediately all of these other characters turn to Aragorn as their leader. And it's kind of like in the sense that Frodo has to take on his task or not, it's up to him, but it's kind of presented to him as this is something that you should do. That's kind of what I think we see Aragorn going through, and he has to kind of decide about whether or not he wants to sort of fully embody that leader role and accept that that's who he is, because the other characters already have. And I think eventually we kind of see him settle into that a little bit more.
Yeah. I think it's interesting how he views his own identity, because when he first encounters Éomer, he introduces himself as Strider. He doesn't say that he's Aragorn, he doesn't say that he's like the heir of Isildur, which is interesting because I guess if he wants to exert power immediately, he would say that. But the fact that he chooses to identify himself as Strider perhaps shows that he doesn't really want to fully claim that power yet, or whether he still wants to kind of cling on to that identity of the Dunedain in the wild.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's really interesting to see how he views himself as a character versus like you clearly know that, especially being that he's obviously like compared to the hobbits bigger in size and appears more able and stronger and obviously naturally would be bigger than elves and that kind of thing. He embodies that leadership in so many ways except for in his own like self view. And I think obviously being like from a family of leaders, it's kind of like I think we talked about in the last live show, potentially a part of his character that he kind of didn't want to accept or didn't want to take on, but obviously naturally he ends up sort of accepting that. And then we've also had a question asking if I expected Gandalf to flag. Now, I was saying to Lucy before the live show that I was constantly throughout this book waiting for someone to die, because I just felt like this is kind of like, this is an adult fantasy series. I'm like, this is not going to end well. Someone's going to die and I'm going to be upset about it. So potentially I did feel that, you know, maybe Gandalf might have been that character. However, I also recognize how powerful he was and everything. So there's a part of me that was like, I don't think this is going to be the devastating death that they've kind of like made out to be. So I hadn't given it a huge amount of thought because you're also caught up in the action and kind of like following along. But at the same time, I feel like if it would have been any of the other characters, I would have been a lot more sad. But with Gandalf, I feel like there was always that element of maybe expecting that he wasn't gone for, for real. I don't even know if I expected it to maybe be like Star Wars and you'd have like, Force ghosts, and whether or not he'd come back in some way to guide them, whether or not that was as his like full embodiment of character or whether it was more of like a sort of spiritual guide or something. But I kind of expected that he wouldn't just be gone completely.
Yeah. I mean, like, I don't know whether it says explicitly in The Lord of the Rings, but he's basically like this reincarnation of, I don't know how you say like the word, but Maya or something like that. And he was sent by the Valar, so he is almost like this godlike savior figure.
Yeah.
And perhaps you could also use that as another kind of depiction of heroism, the fact that he does fight, but he's almost this higher being that is sent down to influence this like pinnacle moment in history.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there's definitely something about him that feels above that mortal status, and you feel like there's more to him as a character. And obviously he's a wizard, so you kind of get that experience anyway, but like I know what you mean, where he kind of feels like a more significant being than the other characters.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of had a feeling that he wasn't gone completely. So we've kind of touched on this already because I mentioned it with the Ents, but nature is obviously a really big part of the entirety of the series, and because we're following these characters on journeys, we see so many different landscapes. So how did you feel about that depiction of nature?
I think it's really interesting how Tolkien empowers nature, but he doesn't necessarily depict it as this like benevolent force. You can see with the, again, I don't know how to pronounce the names, but the Huons or the, not the Ents, but the other force that basically like defeat the orcs. Pippin characterizes them as dangerous, and it kind of shows that Tolkien is giving power to nature, but not making them kind of subjugated by human kind of desire or will. They have their own will, and that means that they can be good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
And with the Fellowship of the Ring, there was also the Old Forest, and they were very much characterized by Bombadil as quite uncontrollable and dangerous. So I think it's interesting how Tolkien doesn't say that nature is purely this like benevolent thing that will do anything that we want it to. Is very much empowering nature to have its own authority and its own power to do what they want with it.
Yeah, I definitely get that in certain elements of the book, and obviously it's most obvious in the situations where you have characters like the Ents who are like a physical embodiment of nature. But I also think because we see so many different landscapes, there's also an exploration of the way that like humanity and all of these other races have the capacity to affect and influence the nature and surrounding of the areas. And so like going back right to the beginning, we obviously have the Shire and we have the Hobbits, and they obviously have like a very peaceful and like just like balanced relationship with nature. And there's even a part in this book where they're talking about how Sam was a gardener, and they were saying how that's like quite a well-regarded profession back at home, and they're obviously just like very at one with nature. Whereas then obviously we start moving towards much darker and more evil places. We're going towards Mordor, and those landscapes are dark and really bleak, and they kind of reflect the morality and like the nature of the characters who embody those spaces. And so I feel like although there's definitely areas where Tolkien like empowers nature to have its own sort of autonomy, there's also parts where it really shows how much the people that take up nature's space affect it.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at how Saruman corrupts nature, that's very much indicative of his immoral character. Is very much almost like this nature versus industrialization kind of theme that Saruman fulfills when he makes everything into machinery.
Yeah, it's definitely there's like a constant like balance, I guess, between how much power nature has itself, but also how much power we sort of wield when we take up nature's space and try to change it. And so there's a definite like balance there, and it kind of shows like both extremes, and then I guess like that balance and sort of state of change in places where nature is kind of going through like the changes that are coming along with battles and sort of modernization, I guess. But someone, oh, that's a good point. So this is interesting because someone said nature allied with the side that served it most, and I think that's true to an extent because you obviously have nature in places like the Shire where it's like thriving and it's lovely and everything. But I also think it's difficult to say that it's sided because nature doesn't necessarily have that control to up and move. We see these characters on a journey through loads of different natural landscapes, but those landscapes can't move themselves unless they're, Ents and they can get up and walk around. But like, the landscape of Mordor is there, that's where it exists, and it doesn't have the choice to leave and ally with a different side because that's just where it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's interesting to see how much the characters can affect the nature. Someone else has asked, what did you think of Theoden's character? I don't know if I pronounced that right. I feel like the films will help me.
Yeah, Theoden.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I have kind of already talked about this before, but kind of the typical warrior figure who bases his own sense of honor in his glory and is all down to, I feel like you could say that Theoden's identity is rooted in how he is perceived by others. As king, he definitely almost has this pressure to perhaps live up to this image, and he's always saying that he wants to be the person who leads his men into battle because as king he feels like he must do that, and that's how he will earn his spot in legends, I guess. So I think Theoden is driven by a desire or a need to be remembered in his home.
And I guess that's quite natural given that like when you're a leader, you're like forever in history attached to the place that you've led, and so it's natural to be concerned with how you will reflect on that period of time. So I guess that makes sense, I think. So moving on to the bit that I'm most excited to talk about, everyone's favorite character, Gollum. Isn't he
so excited?
I was like, I think coming from the perspective of having never read these books before and never watched the films, the only character I really felt like I had an idea about what I was in for was Gollum, because he's obviously so iconic and everyone kind of knows about like the precious and that kind of thing. And so I had an image in my mind about Gollum, and all I expected was that he was just going to be this creepy villainous character, and that definitely held up in the Fellowship of the Ring. We didn't really get much extra with his character, but in this book there is so much more to him, and I was blown away because I found myself feeling sympathy for him, which is something that I didn't anticipate. And he's just so interesting. So
yeah,
your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I totally agree how he is a sympathetic character, and I think perhaps one reason why we are invited to sympathise with him is the connection that Tolkien establishes between Frodo and Gollum. There is one point where I think it says that they're almost akin and they have this understanding between them, and it is because they have both been ring bearers and they have this empathy because they both understand the burden that it has to like carry that, and perhaps that's why Sam is able to mistreat him because he hasn't borne the ring, and that means that he can't fully understand what Gollum has gone through and what drove him to become what he is. So I think the fact that Frodo can empathise with Gollum perhaps means that we can sympathise with him because we see Frodo, we see that he is this character who does have good intentions, and then the fact that Frodo almost has a connection with Gollum makes us reevaluate our opinion of Gollum.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think in a lot of ways, obviously, in terms of like the hierarchy of this little trio that we then get in this book, we have Frodo, who is the master of both Sam and Gollum. And I think there's potentially some jealousy, maybe even on the part of Sam, because maybe he feels like a little bit left out and threatened by being on the same level as a character that he feels superior to. And then, of course, we have like Gollum, who you just don't know how to feel about because he's a character that you obviously know that you probably shouldn't trust, but equally he's so pitiable because you see him as being like just like a shell of a person or of a being, and you feel like he has been so overtaken and corrupted by the ring and by everything that it represents. And I think he's a really interesting character, and we of course see the fact that he does deal with a lot of internal turmoil, which I think I wasn't expecting.
Yeah,
Between his
yeah,
past self and Gollum, who he's obviously become, and that was really
yeah. Yeah, like that shows that there is almost this semblance of what he was. He isn't like this completely corrupt thing that is beyond redemption. There is this almost lingering sense of himself as he would have been before the ring, and I think that makes him a pitiable character because he isn't evil. You can't call him evil because there was someone before the ring that
yeah,
was probably a good person.
and he was like there's a semblance, yeah, like you said, of just like something more to his character. And that's obviously become more and more buried as time has gone on, as he's become more and more corrupted and driven by the ring. But there's still something where you can't quite identify someone as being entirely good or entirely evil. And I think this is a discussion that we had last time in regards to Boromir and how he could so easily just be quickly sort of taken away by the concept of the ring. And then we see in Gollum that taken to the next level with someone who has experienced it being the bearer, and you see the effect that has. And someone said something very interesting here, which is that Sam hates Gollum for representing what Frodo might become. I hadn't even thought of that, but oh my god, you are so clever. That is such a good
That
point.
literally imagine like that must have been so terrifying for Sam though. Like
Yeah,
imagine looking on Gollum being like, that is literally what Frodo could become.
honestly, because like Gollum obviously physically is like a disturbing and like repulsive character, and he's described in ways that are like like insect like. He kind of like crawls around, he acts like an animal, and obviously going by the imagery that is created of the character in the films, he's not a nice character to look at. But then when you pair that with the personality thing, it's like it's terrifying to see how much power the ring has. So I'm not sure about this. Someone asked if his split personality. I was assuming that that was only after the ring, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. Like, it's Smeagol Gollum. So Smeagol was his name before the ring, and then Gollum is kind of what people call him because of like the noise that he makes. So it's almost like maybe before and after you could see. Like Smeagol is what he was before, and then Gollum is what he is after the ring.
Yeah, but then there's just like little bursts where Smeagol tries to resurface and kind of reasons with him, but obviously that's far less powerful than Gollum, I guess. But I just found his character to be really, really interesting because there were times when you felt like he did genuinely have that connection with characters and he kind of wanted to help them, but then at the same time, little bits would come up where you're like, oh no, he only really cares about the ring, and it was very difficult to determine like what you thought of him as a character.
Mm.
So I really found it like an interesting experience, and it was something I wasn't expecting because of how I just expected him to be like a standard villain, and then there was way more to him than that, which I really liked.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see where it goes in the next one. But
My lips are sealed.
wait and see. But I would, yeah, I just think Gollum is so interesting. I'm always such a like sucker for villain backstories, and so I think having that character who is like not quite a villain but certainly not good is really interesting because you're seeing that like ongoing divide and turmoil, which is just so interesting. So you have mentioned already about Faramir, and we've of course just been talking about Boromir as well. So those are of course two characters that are very connected and both interact with Sam and Frodo. So what did you think of him as a character?
Obviously he was one of my favorite characters from this book. I love the way that he values wisdom and knowledge above glory, and I think that is very much emphasized by how he is contrasted to Boromir. I think at one point Emir says that Boromir almost seems more as if he belongs to Rohan than to Gondor, and like I said, Rohan is very much a place that values glory, and Boromir definitely valued glory. That's why he was attracted to the ring, because he wanted to use it to support Gondor's kind of glorious status as the defender of the West. Whereas Faramir, obviously, he doesn't even for 1 second want to take the ring, and he is not attracted to glory. He wants Gondor to be remembered for its Numenorian status as being very wise and having all this knowledge. And I think that's the main difference between them. And I think that's just why I like Faramir's character so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's almost something slightly Gandalf-like about him in the sense that he recognizes the power of the ring, and as soon as Sam kind of lets slip that that's what they're doing, he then is like, don't mention it again, don't want to see it, just forget that it ever happened, essentially. And he just knows that that would be too much and it's better to just sort of leave it unsaid. And I think when his character first came into this book, I was nervous and a little bit like mistrusting because of Boromir, and you have that kind of mistrust of characters where you don't want to sort of assume that they're there to do something nice. And then obviously he then kind of like proved himself, and I think comparing him to Boromir, you kind of see like two sides of the same coin and how they both have essentially good intentions, because we've discussed last time that Boromir wasn't an evil character and he didn't want to take the ring for a negative reason, but it seemed that obviously Faramir has that ability to reason and recognize that taking the ring wouldn't bring any good to his cause.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, does Sam say that Faramir reminds him of Gandalf? I think he does at one point in the story. Yeah.
And obviously, like, he treats the hobbits with quite a lot of kindness. But having just discussed Gollum, what did you think about how Faramir treated Gollum when he turns up?
I'm actually trying to remember because I read this book a while ago.
Kind of like showing eating the fishes, and he wants to just like kill him, and then Frodo kind of persuades him not to, but he makes it very clear that if he wasn't under Frodo's protection, then he would basically just kill him.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder whether that's perhaps against Gollum or just the fact that he was in this forbidden place, and maybe just because he was in the wrong place, wrong time. But kind of like what you said before, the fact that Gollum does appear to be a villain is just maybe his perception that kind of led him to believe that he was an evil character, and it's only really Frodo who understands Gollum and therefore is able to have sympathy for him.
Yeah, I think obviously when you think about like the treatment of Gollum, I think it kind of reflects how a lot of the characters are treated in this book, in the sense that I do think appearances are important and people are far more willing and open to helping characters like the hobbits who look innocent and look like they maybe are in need of help versus a character like Gollum who looks unpleasant and like they are associated with dark things essentially. And I think obviously we have the orcs as well who are not attractive to look at and you associate them with evil. And there's certainly a sense that your sort of moral leaning kind of has an impact on appearance, I think. And we obviously see that in nature as well.
Yeah, but I also think that Tolkien also does suggest that appearances can be deceiving,
Yeah.
which again kind of feeds into the fact that everyone can contribute. Like the hobbits, they don't look like a very powerful force, but it is the hobbits that do change the course of Middle Earth, and also Aragorn, who first appears as this kind of suspicious looking figure, but he's actually a king. So it's very much like Tolkien does suggest that you can't fully understand someone just by looking at them.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about like how that can work in both your favor and to your disadvantage, because for the hobbits they're kind of unassuming, their appearance makes them seem as though they wouldn't be as courageous and as brave as they are, and so they actually end up getting and attracting a lot of help and people who are sympathetic to their cause and want to help them in their journey. And so their appearance kind of aids them, even though it's not reflective of who they are internally. And then with Gollum and everything, obviously he's not really on a noble quest, so it's not quite the same thing. But his appearance, regardless of who he is on the inside, ultimately does put him at a disadvantage because people are immediately suspicious of his character, like from the moment that they see him.
Mm.
Which I think is interesting. It's definitely like appearances are definitely a complex thing in this book, and it's certainly not what it seems on the surface. But I think it is interesting to think about how they can both help you and also put you at a disadvantage. And then, of course, I think we're coming towards the end of the book, and the end of this book was wild.
To say the least.
Such a ride. So, what did you think?
I mean, I did watch the films before I read the books, so it wasn't a massive surprise to me, but still, whenever I read it, I'm literally just like, if I was reading this for the first time, I honestly would have just gone straight into Return of the King. Like, I don't think I would have been able to deal with that cliffhanger because it's so intense, and even though I know what's going to happen, I'm just like, I'm reading, I'm like, oh my God. It's just, yeah, I think it is like an action-packed scene, but it also really exposes Sam's character and his motivations, especially because I think ultimately Sam is devoted to Frodo, not necessarily the quest, because when it comes down to it, he goes after Frodo. He doesn't take the ring and continue the journey. So I think that does, I don't know, it shows that everyone has their own kind of personal motivations. It's not necessarily everyone is just here for the quest.
Mm-hmm.
Sam is there for Frodo, and that's kind of where his main loyalty is.
Yeah, I think I like nearly cried because I was like, oh my God, it's happened. The worst has happened. But then it kind of became a little bit better, but it was still concerning. And I definitely do want to see Return of the King like immediately to see what happens. But essentially, to try and summarize my thoughts, because I could go on about this bit all day because there's just so much happens in the last bit of this book. I feel like it's obviously devastating because you have this like little duo, the best two characters that we've got, and then they're obviously like separated by these horrific circumstances. And Sam, you see, is just so tortured about what is the best thing to do. He obviously in his heart wants to stay with Frodo, but then knows that he wants to try and complete the quest for him. I think because Sam is Frodo's like servant essentially. I don't think he's necessarily got the best self-esteem, and I think he doubts his own ability to complete the quest alone, and therefore he starts doubting it, and then of course he figures out what's actually happened, but that he's lost Frodo anyway, and it's just so complex, and like there's so much going on, so it was a lot.
Yeah, I know, it's just
It's like
so much.
I just didn't even know what to think. It was so sad. I just love Sam so much. I'm like,
Yeah. And like going back to heroism again, I think like when orcs mistake him for like this really like buff elf warrior when he's just a hobbit, I think like that was so funny, but I think it also kind of feeds in again to that idea of heroism because Sam like fights Shelob and is depicted as like this massive thing, like no one has ever done that before. And the fact that it was a hobbit, it shows that heroism can come in all different forms, and I just love that. I thought that was, yeah.
yeah. I think that again comes back to what we discussed earlier about how intention is more important than action itself, because I think it was the motivation behind Sam deciding to try and fight Shelob was because not because he just wanted to have the glory of having done it before anyone else. It was purely to protect Frodo, and therefore this like unexplainable power kind of came out of him, which wouldn't have been there otherwise. And I think that sort of power and motivation behind it is what really gave him the ability. Whereas if he'd just been this buff elf, I don't think he would have been able to do it just based on the motivation of glory. So I think it's definitely down to the intention. But it was also such a charged scene because you had like obviously the interaction with Gollum before, which you mentioned about how you start to feel a little bit of sympathy for Gollum because he's described as being like, if you just came upon the scene, he looked just like an old, weary hobbit. And at that point, you're like feeling a bit sympathetic to him because Sam calls him sneaky and says that he's off like sneaking around doing bad things. And then Gollum defends himself and says, I'm trying to look out for you and find you a way to get around this and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, yeah, thanks, Gollum. You're doing us a good job. And then that he was just sneaking around, and then there's just so much going on and so many emotions that I think there's a lot of adrenaline that gave Sam that power.
And like you can almost tie it back to the quote that Faramir says. Like he says that he doesn't admire the weapons, he admires the motivation or what they're defending. And like Sam, he was motivated by his love for Frodo. That's his main motivational force, and I think that makes their friendship just so much more admirable and emotionally moving because it is their love and their friendship that ultimately enables them to keep going.
Yeah, and I think then that also makes the conclusion even more devastating because I think Sam is on such like a high of emotion in trying to protect Frodo, and once that all kind of dies away and it's back to just being the two of them, and then he realizes that there's like quite a bad injury going on and that it might be too late to save him, it becomes just like even more devastating because you saw how far he was willing to go and how much he was willing to put himself in danger to try and protect him, and you see like how much he values Frodo as a character, and it's just so sad.
I know.
Too much.
Sam, honestly.
I'm still so curious about the person who said that they didn't like Sam. I'm like at the end of book 2 now, and I'm still struggling to see where dislike has come from.
Yeah, I mean, like the only thing I could think of is his treatment of Gollum.
Yeah, and I mean, I do get that because I don't think it's nice, but equally, his mistrust of Gollum was founded on quite, logical grounds, and he ended up being right. And so I feel like although he wasn't necessarily very nice to him, I think his mistrust was well placed, and he could have been mistrustful and not necessarily as cruel. But I think overall, the cruelty, I think, predominantly came from his desire to protect Frodo, and he kind of recognizes that Frodo is maybe sometimes too nice, and he was worried about that. So I think I still struggle to see why someone wouldn't like lovely Sam.
Yeah. No, I don't. Just so pure.
Stop.
Ooh.
Explain.
Explain.
I'd love to know why, because honestly, like, I feel like I'm blinded by my love for Sam. So, like, I would really like to know
Yeah.
why you don't. 100% open to all opinions. But it is just interesting because for me, he's just such a lovely character. But equally, I think I saw that you mentioned, bit narrow-minded. Yeah, I think you could definitely argue that because he's very much, I think, in the way that I'm blinded by my love for Sam, I think he's blinded by his desire to protect Frodo. And therefore, I think he is a bit narrow-minded in the sense that he's just very tunnel vision. He's got one motivation, and that's that. So I suppose that is true. But I do love him. Someone loves him even more in the second book.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, so I'm now obviously at the end of the second book, and each of these books are split into 2 parts. And so I think that sort of I was having a look. Are we back?
Oh. Yeah.
I think we're back. Okay, so
Yeah.
I was just saying how they're all split into 2 parts. So I've now read 4 sections of The Lord of the Rings, and I was having a little think at the end of this book about which one I've enjoyed the most. And I think on the whole, I really did like this second half of The Two Towers the most out of all of the different sections. But on the whole, I've said that I enjoyed The Fellowship of the Ring more as a book because I enjoyed both of those parts a lot, whereas I didn't quite like the first part of Two Towers as much. But then the second part was so good. So I was just wondering, like, whether you had favorite bits or like whether you just kind of see it all as one.
I can never like define a favorite when it comes to Lord of the Rings in general, like whether it's characters or books or anything, because I think they are so different. And the fact that the Fellowship of the Ring obviously follows all of them when they're united and they're like one collective group, whereas with the Two Towers, obviously there's so many different strands. I think it is hard to compare those 2 books because they're so different. And also, I don't think I could pick a favorite half out of the Two Towers because I think each section has something different to offer. Like with Frodo and Sam's section, I really like how it does focus on their friendship and also Gollum as a character and this idea of redemption or empathy. And then with Rohan, I think it does focus on perhaps heroism and glory and this kind of warrior ideal. And then with the Ents, they're like a whole different kind of perspective. Like, yeah, I think each one they're just so different. It's so hard to pick a favorite, and honestly, I don't think I would be able to pick a favorite book out of all of them.
No, it is difficult. I think I definitely, yeah, I think I treated The Fellowship of the Ring just as one book, but with this one, I think with the 2 halves being so different from each other in the characters that you're following, I really noticed the transition between the 2 parts, and I think that's where I ended up picking out the second one as being even more enjoyable, just for me personally. But I do agree that they all add so much to the story, and you wouldn't want to take any of them away.
Definitely.
This is an interesting point about Sam and his view of other characters, seeing them in a more exotic way rather than as people or animals, but just as attractions.
Yeah, I think did you contribute that to the Discord chat? Because I feel like I've read that point before, but I do think that's really interesting because Sam, like, he has this fascination with elves. Got there eventually. And yeah, like the Oliphants, he is very like almost entranced by these beings, and I don't know, perhaps that does make him different to Frodo, for example. Frodo, he's almost kind of he has this connection with the elves, or he is described a few times of is having this kind of elvish air about him, and like he does understands elvish as a language. So yeah, maybe Sam is a bit more of an outsider, perhaps. He's kind of like this hobbit, kind of looking in onto all these amazing different creatures in Middle Earth, whereas maybe Frodo has a bit more of a spiritual or emotional connection to them, maybe.
Yeah, I think potentially, like, again, it comes down to self view and like how the characters view themselves, because I feel like potentially having been with Bilbo for so long, Frodo is almost a little bit desensitized, having like been exposed to so many like incredible stories and like just being more open to this wider worldview and having this desire to maybe explore further afield. And obviously he has this, I guess, affirmation of what he's doing in the sense that he is completing a task that's been set for him. Whereas I think Sam sees himself as being from maybe a more simple background and only being there in order to help Frodo. And so I think that maybe his view is just like he's more overwhelmed by the circumstances and stuff because it's not something that he ever would have considered doing or seeing as in his path. And so when it became that way, it's just like a lot to take in.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just like, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot to take in. And when it's something that's brand new to you and you've never even considered exploring that far afield, it is obviously a lot. And it would seem exotic, I suppose, if you've never like come across these things before. And obviously they both
Mm.
just did it slightly differently. I think it's more, yeah, like someone else said, I think it's more like he enjoys seeing all of these things and tries to sort of notice. And I think it's maybe like, yeah, that he's just kind of in awe of them.
Yeah. And I think like there are a few times when Sam's like, "Oh, I can't wait to tell the old gaffer about this." Like it's almost as if he's going on this small adventure and he'll go home and perhaps that's helping him to get through it. This idea that he will return back home and kind of be able to share the story. And like you mentioned before, the part where Sam's like, "Oh, well, we might be in a story one day," is
Yeah,
almost trying to make this horrible quest into something that's a bit more comforting and adventurous.
yeah. It's definitely something, yeah, I'd agree with that because I think it's like a terrifying quest. There's no way to know how it will end. And so there's almost, yeah, a sense of trying to convince yourself that it will be okay. So instead of focusing on the peril that potentially awaits them, it's like focusing on the fact that he's seeing things that he's read about and heard of that just seemed like distant imaginations, and now they're actually part of his reality. So that's like a different way to kind of cope with it. So I think we are coming towards the end of this live show. I've seen a couple of questions there. I'm just going to answer one that someone's asked to me. If you have any more questions before the end of the show, just leave them in the side and we'll get to them before we finish up. Someone has asked, what are my predictions and hopes for the third volume? Now, I, as a mere mortal, I'm not even going to attempt to try and predict what Tolkien is going to have done in the third volume because I'm just so beneath his level of thinking that I'm not even gonna, humiliate myself with trying to get myself on that level. But hopes are no one dies. There's my hopes. Everyone lives and it's happily ever after. The hobbits go back to the Shire and everyone is happy, and Sam and Frodo get in their stories, and that is what I want to happen. So I might be a bit far off with that, but that is my hopes.
I'm not saying anything.
Yeah, that's fine. So I will wait and see. So that, yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see. I'm sure whatever happens, it will be incredible. But I'm so emotionally attached to these characters that I want them all to be okay. It's almost like, I think in Game of Thrones, when I've read that, I know I've compared these books quite a few times before, but I expect characters to die left, right, and centre. And I kind of was in a similar position to you with Game of Thrones in the sense that I had read the books after watching the TV shows. So I was a lot more desensitized and I was expecting what was going to happen. Whereas with this, it is kind of scary reading a book for the first time without knowing what was going to happen because literally anything could happen. And I want to.
Yeah. I literally can't imagine reading these books like without knowing what's going to happen. But I find it so interesting having your perspective because like I'm almost feeling what I would be feeling or what you're feeling, like this excitement and all the nervousness. Like I'm almost feeling that because you're experiencing it for the first time.
Like there's so much anticipation, but also so much nervousness because I just feel like something terrible is going to happen, I'm sure, but I just don't know what it's going to be. And then someone else has asked us if we have listened to the audiobooks. I personally haven't because it's my first time reading the books and I prefer to read physically, so I've never listened to the audiobook. I don't know if you have, Lucy.
No, I haven't, but I definitely should because so many people praise the audiobooks. So like I definitely need to do that. Maybe next year when I read them again.
I might when I come to read them again, I might try and do it as audiobooks and see what that's like. And then someone else has left a really nice comment, which is just to say, thank you for doing the read along. It's been such a joy. And I just want to say thank you all for taking part because obviously it wouldn't have been the same if it wasn't, people taking part. So it's been really nice to have all of your opinions and to be able to read the series for the first time along with so many other people.
Yeah, definitely. Like this has been amazing just to see everyone participating and offering their opinions because that's what I love, the fact that we can discuss these books and everyone has so many different thoughts and opinions. Like that's what makes the book so fun.
Yeah. And these books are so complex and there's so many layers. And I think being able to discuss my first read of the series with all of you guys has just made it so much better and has helped me, I think, to understand the series a lot more because there's so much going on. And I think being able to discuss it just makes it like you digest it and really like process what you've read rather than just kind of like taking it in and then forgetting about it. And so I'm really having a great time and I cannot wait to read Return of the King.
Oh gosh, I'm so excited for you.
I know, I'm terrified, but mostly excited. Yeah, speaking of Return of the King, the live show for that one is going to be at the same time, so 7 p.m, and it's going to be on Friday, the 14th of August, and it will be on Lucy's channel. Her channel is already linked down below, so definitely go and check her out and subscribe if you're not already, because you definitely should be. And we'll be over there in a couple of weeks to talk about the final book in the series.
God.
I can't believe it. We've been on such a journey.
I know. I mean, not as intense as their journey, but
no, but still, it's a lot.
Yeah.
So thank you all so much for joining us tonight to talk about the Two Towers. It has been incredible as always, and the Return of the King read along is currently going on until that live show on the 14th of August, and the Discord chat will also be linked down below, so definitely go and join us over there so that we can chat about the books until that live show. But until then, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Bye. Bye.